Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on the DPS rankings for all specializations in Dragonflight. We have some pretty major class tuning buffs and nerfs coming in on the reset on Tuesday. This will be looking at week 8's final numbers for DPS. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. And we'll start out like we always do by looking at last week's numbers. So this was week 7 on screen right now. This was the end of last week after 10.0.5 had gone live, all those major changes. We wanted to check in to see where the classes had ended up. And you can see some of the specializations after the big update had a huge change in where they ranked overall. And we had some classes and specializations that were really struggling as a result of what had happened in the patch. But now let's take a look at week 8. A full week has gone by. Some minor tuning has gone in, but again, we're waiting for the big tuning, major buffs and changes that are coming in with the reset going into week 9. And here we are, another week after the big patch had gone live. More data, more practicing, more simming, more theory crafting going into each class, and this is where we ended up at the end of week 8. The first thing to note is that survival hunters are not surviving. They obviously didn't receive any changes in 10.0.5 and nothing in the previous hotfixes either. So for 2 straight weeks in a row, the survival hunter is going to be the bottom of the ranking in all categories: heroic raid, mythic raid, and mythic plus. If you're wondering, this data is pulled directly from Warcraft logs, their actual log parses. This is over the course of 10.0.5, so since that patch went live, with the maximum parse percentage for all of the class DPS specs in heroic raid, mythic raid, and mythic plus. The reason I like including heroic raid, by the way, is because it ends up being quite different from mythic raid. The group size can vary in heroic raid, and often the difficulty of heroic raid is not enough to shut down classes. A lot of times you can, I call it cooking the books, but you can, free heal a 20-man and get high, HPS. You can, get extra stacks on a blood DK and get crazy high parses on healing. So there's different ways to cheat it. But let's look at the overall on the right side, and we'll talk through each of them as we go down for the overall. So enhancement, another week in a row, enhancement gets the #1 slot overall. And you can see on the left side rankings, it's not because they are #1 in any category, but because they are unbelievably consistent. They are the only spec really that is holding the top 3 in all 3 categories. Devastation does great in raid, does poorly in mythic plus. Windwalker does amazingly in mythic plus, but does average in raid, both heroic and mythic raid. But enhancement does extremely well in heroic raid, mythic raid, and mythic plus, which gives them the #1 slot overall. In second is Devastation. Devastation has seen probably like 4 or 5 rounds of buffs. It was incredibly effective on their single target. It helped their disintegrate becoming more and more useful. They got some nice changes that helped up the tree. They're getting even more in 10.0.7. And if you're wondering about those changes, I can put a link to the video covering the class changes in 10.0.7 down in the description. I went through all the changes they have listed on the PTR right now. But Devastation takes the second overall slot for a very polarizing performance. They are #2 in heroic raid and #2 in mythic raid. Exceptionally high DPS parses. Very encouraging to see them parsing really well in mythic raid, considering they started the expansion and season 1 relatively average at best, and in the very beginning they were actually quite low. But for mythic plus, they struggle quite a lot in keeping up with the other classes, especially this week with the affixes that kind of showed up for them. If they have to move a lot, it can be really annoying. Spiteful can cause a lot of disruption for Devastation because they have to cancel their channels, they have to cancel their empowers, and they can't line up their pyres as easily with the right stacks if they have to constantly run away from things or get interrupted. So in Mythic Plus, they're struggling a lot. Let me know what you think about Devastation and Mythic Plus. It could be that they're very reliant on having Dragonfire available, and outside of that, they're not super useful. Obviously, when you look at their parses in Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid, they do have excellent single target, and I would argue they have good AoE as well. It could be just that the AoE is on too long of a cooldown. You can't line it up as often as you'd like. You really need to have that Dragonfire cooldown up, even if you're running the Deep Breath or whatever it's called that does the ground target. You can do some decent AoE, but it could just be that their AoE is too far spread apart. So when you're doing big non-boss pulls, non-single target pulls, they don't keep up with the other classes. In the third slot is Havoc, for the same reason as Enhancement, just being consistent in all categories. They do well in Raid, they do well in Mythic Plus. They're still in the top 5 for both Raid and then top 6 for Mythic Plus. Nothing really changed with Havoc overall. They've just been good and they've stayed there, and they don't show any sign of changing in that position. The only changes they've been making for Havoc have been in PvP specifically, but in PvE, they've been holding steady. In the fourth slot is Shadow Priest overall, partially because of their amazing Mythic Raid performance. I'm noticing a trend with Mythic Raid parses since the highest guilds that perform the best, they only have one lockout that they usually run, maybe one or two. And every time there's a big change to a class, especially later in the season when they've got their clears, they're not really pressed for anything, they're just kind of on farm. They'll usually bring whatever got changed and push it as hard as they can to see how high it goes. And that mentality has an impact on the performance of that specialization that week. So when Shadow got buffed, people want to see how high it can go. They've been pushing it. Every time a class gets changed, we see a big uptick in Mythic Raid, more so than any other. I would argue that Mythic Plus and Heroic Raid doesn't have that same kind of impact. Those are probably closer to the natural state of the spec, but we are seeing a pretty obvious trend with Mythic Raid that the specializations that get changed or become the most interesting end up showing up the most in Mythic Raid, just because I guess the top 1% people are really trying to test it out. But Shadow, Shadow was like average, and they've always been a spec that scales well later into the season. I was shocked when they buffed Shadow, and then they buffed Shadow again, and then they buffed Shadow again in 10.0.5. I don't really know why they kept buffing it. It didn't seem like it. I mean, sure, on the number side, they had numbers there, but Shadow is always a sleeper and always scales. So here we go. Number 1 parse, the highest DPS in Mythic Raid this week was for Shadow Priest. Underneath the Shadow is Unholy DK, actually a standard deviation away from everyone else in Heroic Raid. So again, if they get PI, if they have the right conditions, if they have the bloodlust and they have crazy haste and they're left alone, they don't have to do mechanics and they can just slam, their numbers are disgusting. It's actually ridiculous how much damage Unholy DKs can put out. This week though, in Mythic Raid, when they have to move around a lot, they are rather slow. They only have Death's Advance or Wraith Walk. It's hard for them to move around a lot. When they have to do mechanics regularly and use globals on things that aren't damage, they don't stack up as well to other classes. But if they can just go ham, their ability to parse right now is probably the best in the game. It's insane how much damage Unholy can do. In the same regard for Mythic Plus, DKs ever since 10.0.5 have been struggling in Mythic Plus. I'm not really sure why, to be honest. I can't find a specific reason as to why DKs fell so hard in Mythic Plus ever since 10.0.5. There's nothing that really makes sense to me as this much of a fall, but pushing keys and performing to their best, DKs are among the worst that you can bring. Not Blood DKs, but Unholy and Frost. Keep in mind that in the reset on Tuesday, Frost DKs and Blood DKs are getting major damage buffs, so that should be nice. Unholy is being left untouched, probably because of their potential in raid settings where they can just pump out damage, but we know Frost DK and Blood DK are getting buffed there. Underneath Holy is Balanced Druid. They've kind of hovered in the same spot for raid in the top 3rd. That hasn't changed much, and then in Mythic Plus, they are in the top 4. Their AoE potential is very hard to match relative to other classes, especially when they can stack Starfall now. They have their mushrooms, they have their 4-set bonus. All of that works well for them. No major changes for them this week, but they are still among the best that you can bring in all settings when played properly. Underneath Balance is Demonology. They are doing the best in Heroic Raid and Mythic Plus. They're about average in Mythic Raid. They can't keep up as well with some of the classes when they have to do mechanics, and they can't cheat as much. But when they're left to their own devices, or when it comes down to AoE potential in Mythic Plus, they do extremely well. Windwalker actually is underneath Demonology in the 8th overall slot. They are, this week, the best DPS class, scoring-wise, in Mythic Plus. They are insanely good at Mythic Plus, and it's hard to compete with them at all. When it comes to Raid, they're about average. In Mythic Raid, they perform better than they do in Heroic Raid, which tells you that they are able to do mechanics more in an integral way to their rotation and playstyle, and their overall parsing isn't as good, but when difficulty's on the line, Windwalkers can be relied on, and then they're just insane in Mythic Plus. Frost Mage. You see it just the same as I do. It's kind of confusing, but here we are. Arcane Mage still does great in Heroic Raid, but Frost Mage and Fire Mage shot up a bunch. They got a crazy amount of buffs, very similar to Shadow Priest and Devastation Evoker. They just kept getting buffed and buffed and buffed and buffed and buffed. And a couple hot fixes leading up to 10.0.5, they got damage buffs to their core abilities. And then in 10.0.5, they got a global damage scalar buff that affected all of their damage output, and it seems to have been effective. It didn't take root right away. We saw Frost and Fire come up just a bit from the bottom of the list, and then I guess week 2 in 10.0.5, week 8 total in season 1, Frost Mage is killing it. They're doing amazingly well in Mythic Raid and Heroic Raid. They are still towards the bottom in Mythic Plus, and shockingly this week, Arcane Mage is towards the bottom in Mythic Plus, lower than Frost and Fire. Who would have thunk it? Underneath Frost Mage is Arcane Mage overall, primarily because of their Heroic Raid parsing this week. Mythic Raid, they're below average, and then again, they are towards the bottom in Mythic Plus. I'm curious if they're going to do anything for Arcane Mage. I think in general, Arcane tends to be very good at single target, stacking up and hitting over and over. And then when it comes to AoE, we historically have seen Fire Mage do the best in Mythic Plus, and we're seeing that here as well. But it is kind of interesting to see Arcane start out so well in Season 1, and then 2 months later, they just haven't been able to hold on to that slot, except for in Heroic Raid, where, again, you can stand still, ignore mechanics, and pump damage. So, like Unholy DK, their ability to deal damage is among the best, but when they have to do other things, they have responsibilities, that performance goes down dramatically. Subtlety Rogue, underneath Arcane in the overall, they've just been falling hard. I'm not sure what could have changed for them. They didn't really get major nerfs going into the hot fixes or going into, I guess they kind of did. They got some damage reductions for Outlaw and Subtlety, but in Heroic Raid, their ability to parse is quite weak, or their skill floor is just higher than most. In Mythic Raid, they're doing very well, and Mythic Plus, both Outlaw and Subtlety are doing amazingly well as well. But in the overall, when you stack all 3 categories together, Subtlety is outperforming Outlaw, and there it is. Kind of shocking, but there you go. Arms Warrior is leading the middle of the pack here. They got a lot of buffs going into 10.0.5 and prior as well. They are among the top 6 for Mythic Raid and about average for Heroic Raid, and they are below Fury in Mythic Plus, about average there as well. But Fury started out the season quite strong and has been falling. Arms got a bunch of buffs. Fury didn't get as many, and here's where we're standing right now. Fire Mage, about in the middle of the pack right now, primarily because of their Mythic and Heroic Raid consistency. They're right up there with Balanced Druid, Windwalker, Demonology Warlock, even keeping up with Rogues in some situations. So Fire Mage might be back on the rise. They're being outparsed by Frost Mages in Raid, but they are outperforming Frost Mage in Mythic Plus, which is why we're seeing them where they are right now. Underneath Fire Mage is Outlaw Rogue, just very close to Subtlety. They are underperforming in the parse tests in Heroic Raid, but they're doing excellent in Mythic Plus. They're doing quite well, amazingly in Mythic Raid. They're in that top 8 slot as well. Fury Warrior has been holding on and doing decently in Mythic Plus. Their AoE potential is quite insane, but when it comes to Raid, their Raid is going down again. They've just been kind of, every week, they slowly slip down 1 or 2 slots. They're struggling in single target and struggling in boss mechanics, which is weird because usually Fury scales very well with gear. Once they can maximize their haste and their main stats and breakpoints, typically Fury, just like Shadow Priest, gets better and better, but that's just not the case right now. Retribution Paladin is about average in almost all categories. Mythic Raid, they're about average. Heroic Raid, they're slightly below average. And Mythic Plus, they're slightly below average. Though, We know there's some major reworks coming for Retribution Paladin, so we'll see where they end up after that in 10.0.7. We don't know exactly what those are yet, but we know those are coming. Just underneath Retribution is Elemental Shaman. They are doing below average, not the worst, but below average in Mythic Plus. They're doing above average in Heroic Raid for just single target, just burning, parsing. And in Mythic Raid, they're in the bottom 6. So if they have to move a lot and do mechanics and spend globals on things that aren't damage, they struggle quite significantly. If they can stand and do DPS, they do okay. And then in Mythic Plus, they're okay. I would say their AoE potential in Mythic Plus is very good. In general, I think they can do some serious AoE damage. It's just translated, like they have to, I think the problem with Elemental Shaman, and comment below if you're an Elemental Shaman and you agree with this, but I think the problem with Elemental Shaman is they have like 4 or 5 different builds that all have different stat weightings. They all have different builds in the talent tree. So like if you're speccing for AoE, you can't really spec for single target at the same time and vice versa. So if you're in Mythic Plus and it's Tyrannical Week, you don't really want to not spec for AoE because you have a lot of trash to clear. And you don't really want to not spec for single target because you have these big bosses to clear. And if you can't do both, you may as well take a different spec. And I think that's where Elemental Shaman is right now, is they just have too many builds that have different weightings and requirements, and you can't build for all of them at once. Beast Mastery Hunter is the only hunter that's holding on. Well, Hunter, Beast Mastery and Marksmanship, but in general, all the hunter specs have fallen down. Beast Mastery is doing above average in Mythic Plus. They are doing just below average in Heroic Raid, and they are doing abysmally in Mythic Raid. In fact, it looks like most Mythic guilds aren't bringing hunters as much as they used to. It doesn't really matter what spec they are, just in general. Beast Mastery is surprisingly doing better than Marksmanship in Mythic Plus, and so Beast Mastery is probably your best bet when it comes to hunters in the current state of the game. But again, we know Tuesday, all hunter specs, all 3, Survival, Marksmanship, and Beast Mastery, are getting a global 5% damage buff. It applies to them and their pet damage, so that all scales together. So we'll see. I mean, I think they deserve it. All 3 specs are struggling right now in all categories, so yeah, we'll see where they end up after the patch. Affliction Warlock, towards the bottom underneath Marksmanship. They are they are pretty awful in Mythic Plus. I've started playing my Warlock, trying to gear him out, and I'm on Affliction right now, the right guides for it, and I can definitely feel it. It's just, you have to spend so many globals in a Mythic Plus setting to get ramped up, and then switching, especially in AoE, can be really rough, and if you ever have to move or do anything, like you need to be having your feet planted and constantly managing all your procs and everything. There's just a lot to do, and there's not enough globals to take care of it in many situations. They do okay in Mythic Raid. They do like in the bottom 7 in Heroic Raid. So Affliction still struggling quite a bit, but definitely towards the bottom overall. Feral Druid is 4th from last. I actually don't really know what happened to Feral. They still do quite well in Mythic Plus, but that seems to be the only content that they are beating other classes in. If you look at their performance this week in Heroic Raid and Mythic Raid, they are towards the bottom with the Hunters and Assassination Rogues. They have been struggling quite a lot. This could also be a 4-set thing. Maybe they just need a stronger set bonus. Maybe they just need stronger passives. I don't know. There hasn't really been much balancing around the set bonuses themselves. But yeah, in Raid, Feral Druid been struggling quite a bit and still doing quite well in Mythic Plus, which ends up being an overall low score this week. Assassination Rogue underneath Feral, they really haven't climbed back. In the first maybe 5 weeks of Season 1, they did amazingly in Heroic Raid because they were parsing like crazy, but when they have to do other mechanics and they have to spend globals on things that don't affect their damage, they fall to dust. They have a much harder time keeping up. In Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, you can see that. And then in Heroic Raid, ever since 10.0.5, they just haven't been doing much comparatively to other. It's important to say that we're just talking about these changes. Like if you look at the right side of the screen, the gaps, I'm expanding the gaps because that's where they are. All of these classes can clear Heroic Raid and can get KSM, and all of these classes can push plus 20 keys. Not all of these classes can go over 20 keys. Not all of these classes are going to be in the top parses, especially in Mythic Raid, but it is part of the conversation that we have. Frost DK, second to last. We already talked about where that's at right now, and they are getting significant damage buffs on Tuesday, so we'll see where that lands. And lastly, the Forgotten is Survival Hunter. They are the worst parsers this week in all 3 categories. They are struggling quite a lot, and they're going to get the 5% damage buff on Tuesday, and I don't know if that's going to be enough. Maybe they need something else. We'll see what they get, but right now they are definitely, I would say, number 1 on the pedestal for buffs following the reset on Tuesday. But those are the DPS rankings for week 8. Let me know what you think. If there's anything that surprised you or shocked you, if you have a strong opinion one way or another on any of the specializations here, if you think any of them need buffs or need nerfs urgently, let me know in the comments. I'd love to read about what you guys think. And that is it for me today. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi.
If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.